Okay.
Thank you very much, Sanjida. It's a real pleasure to be doing this talk for Tower Hamlets Local History Library and Archives, and indeed to have done this whole collaboration with them. It's a long time been a happy place for me. So it's been a real pleasure to be able to link my work more closely to that of the archives. So welcome to everybody for this talk on how Jewish writers remembered the East End. And as Sanjida has said, this is part of a public programme of the really unique exhibition, which is currently on show at Tower Hamlets Local History Library and Archive. 3 sound artists, Alistair Levy, Emily Peasgood, and Saima Tariq, have produced an installation using some of the oral history recordings held at the archive. And these are recordings that have been gathered over the last 40 years from Jewish, Bengali, and Somali residents of Tower Hamlets. And the genesis of this exhibition was the recognition that these recordings are really very precious, and many of them were on cassette, on fragile cassettes, and were likely to be unusable very soon unless they were quickly digitized. So part of the project that we've been doing has digitized them and has made them available for anyone who wants to come and use them in the archive, as well as the artists who've used them in their very unique ways in this exhibition. So the exhibition and the research project that it's part of is part of a larger project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And that project explores the ways that the East End has been remembered since the 1980s. The title of the exhibition, Everything is Different, Nothing Has Changed, it's a very striking title. It's taken from a documentary made in 1980 about Spitalfields, a BBC documentary by the director, Dennis Marks. That documentary was made back in 1980 with the archive itself. And it's an attempt to sort of explore and discuss the patterns and repetitions among experiences of Jewish and Bengali migrants to Tower Hamlets across the 20th century. So things like the continuation by Jews and Siletis of the tailoring trade, the importance of faith and religious community, the active building of a diaspora culture, the flourishing of local food cultures, the development of supplementary education to keep children in touch with the religion or the language of their parents and grandparents, the hostilities encountered institutionally and on the streets, and the grassroots resistance. So these were subjects that interested us too in our research project. Our team focused in particular on sources that capture glimpses of daily life in the Jewish East End, on memoirs and autobiographies, on humorous sketches of urban life in the Yiddish language press, and in oral history recordings. Our work, including what I'm going to present tonight, will be published shortly, so you can see more if you're interested, and please don't hesitate to get in touch with me if you're interested to talk more about it or to hear more about it. So we've been interested in the project in how this place, Tower Hamlets, has been experienced imaginatively. Its streets, its homes, its places of work and worship, linked to other places. And looking closely at these kinds of sources, many of which are not sources that are usually examined by historians, has helped us recover a very vivid sense of the daily life of the past. But many of them are also documents of memory. They speak retrospectively, infusing experience with hindsight, with insight, and with imagination. And I'm a literary historian, and so in this talk, I'm going to focus on literary text. I'm going to move away from the oral histories that are the focus of the exhibition and of my colleagues' investigations. And I'm going to be looking at written accounts, memoirs, autobiographies, and novels, often which overlap with each other in many ways. And I think these texts fuse the changes in the landscape of the East End with the passing of time in the writer's own life. So I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to show some images that are going to go with the talk that I'm going to give. So you'll just see a little version of me from this point on. Okay, that's it. So I thought actually I would begin by asking the question what we mean by the Jewish East End in the first place. So I'm going to say a little bit of background. Some of this may be very familiar to you, or it may not be, but bear with me if it is familiar. The story of Britain's Jewish population. Well, England's Jewish population had been expelled in the 13th century and only readmitted in the 17th century. For nearly 200 years, Jews remained a tiny religious minority in this country. In the second half of the 19th century, however, and especially accelerating between 1881 and 1914, between 120,000 and 150,000 East European Jews settled permanently in the United Kingdom, expanding the Jewish population to 300,000. Jews entering Britain at this time, from the 1880s onwards, were escaping religious persecution and chronic economic hardship. They arrived from towns and villages in Russia, Romania, and the area that was at that time known as Galicia, modern-day Poland and Ukraine. More than a third arriving in London in this period were nearly or completely penniless. Many were religious-minded, others were secular, and some were politically radical, socialists, anarchists, or Zionists. Their presence was most concentrated in the East End of London, where low-wage employment was readily available in small garment workshops or furniture workshops or shoe workshops, and where an earlier generation of Jewish migrants had established synagogues on the edge of the city of London, as the eastern edge of the city of London. And an idiosyncratic immigrant subculture developed in Spitalfields and Whitechapel, with rivalrous institutions, synagogues, religious schools, and also a secular cultural life centered around Yiddish language newspapers, political organizing, theatre, and social clubs. And this map, which was compiled by two researchers from Toynbee Hall in 1899, shows the Jewish population of the East End. Here, in more detail, we can see Spitalfields, and this map is color-coded. It was following a method that had been established by the sociologist Charles Booth, which to kind of indicate population through color coding. So the dark blue areas here indicate that these places, colored dark blue, are 95 to 100% Jewish population. So you can see this is extremely dense, particularly in Spitalfields around Whitechapel at the turn of the century. What the map doesn't tell you, and what you really have to go to more popular cultural sources to find, is what a fractured community it was. It was a community in the midst of change, one that would stay fractured by change for many decades. A community in which no one agreed with one another about anything at all, not about politics, not about gender relations, not about Englishness, and certainly not about religion. And in the following 2 decades, Jewish settlement expanded eastwards along the Whitechapel Road, in fact, and sort of a little bit south into Stepney, where new synagogues, a school, and a hospital were established, and also where my grandfather had his salt beef cafe on the Mile End Road opposite Stepney Green Station, which is, by extraordinary coincidence, just a stone's throw away from Queen Mary College and indeed the archives. There we are, that's it. And by the 1920s, some of the children of these Victorian immigrants had moved even further east and also northwest to the developing suburbs. Nonetheless, the East End remained the hub of Jewish life in London. But a great deal was to change in the 1940s. The bombing of the Second World War devastated all the communities of the East End. And this is another color-coded map showing the Whitechapel area and the bomb damage. So you can see the black areas there, indicating that, you know, the very widespread damage to, this is just Whitechapel, but of course the whole of East London suffered enormous damage and devastation in the bombing. Overall, 30,000 were killed, 100,000 houses were destroyed, and 1 million damaged. So the possibility of life in the East End, continuing in the East End, was really altered profoundly. Many had been evacuated and didn't return. Many moved to temporary or new housing elsewhere in the post-war years. And for the Jews of the East End, with their cultural life, their social life, their religious life, so focused on this area, more than half a century of development was arrested. And one of the first people to document the impact of the bombing on Jewish social and religious life was the journalist A.B. Levy. He wrote a series of articles in 1948 for the Jewish newspaper, the Jewish Chronicle, and a few years later they were published as a book. And Levy is surveying the landscape of Whitechapel, the post-war landscape of Whitechapel, which he's comparing to what he knows of how it was before, and finds it unrecognizable. Looking eastward from Aldgate down the Whitechapel Road, there are gaping holes in the streetscape, and we can see that from this map. But missing too are key elements in the infrastructure of Jewish life. The kosher communal restaurant on Whitechapel Road beyond Brady Street is bombed and deserted. And this was Duke's Place Synagogue in Aldgate, a grand cathedral-style synagogue which was first established in 1690, but completely destroyed apart from this single sort of facade remaining, one wall remaining, during the Blitz. Levy, the journalist, he interviews Mr. Bogdan, who is librarian at the Whitechapel Library and has been the librarian of the Whitechapel Library for more than 40 years. This is when Whitechapel Library was right next to the Whitechapel Gallery, or above Aldgate East Station. And the librarian tells him that he has many memories of eager, plodding young men and women, ambitious for success and often attaining it. The library had 4,000 Jewish interest books in Hebrew, Yiddish, and English. So 4,000 amongst its very, very, very large collection, but it was still a very significant collection of Jewish interest books. And that was because it had a very enormous Jewish clientele that used these books a lot. But the whole top floor of the library was burnt out during the war, and much of that collection was destroyed. The students' room, writes Levy, so busy in olden days, is no longer used. And the reference room, where once you were lucky to find a seat, is a dismal sight these evenings, all but empty. Yet there is a distinctively lit spirit tone to Levy's writing. He notes that many of the changes visible in the East End of the early 1950s reflect broader changes in post-war Jewish life. The Whitechapel Library, for example, is actually still lending its Judaica collection to as many readers as it had done before the war, because it's now lending books outside the borough. So it's lending its books to the same people, but those people have moved. And in Buxton Street, where there used to be a Jewish welfare and advisory centre, the building has now been repurposed as a centre for cooking kosher lunches for school children who now live outside the East End. So Levy thinks that this demonstrates that the East End is as central as it ever was to Jewish life. Because even though Jews were increasingly leaving Whitechapel, Whitechapel remained a hub for the community's religious and welfare services. Or there was also the case where welfare services which had once been founded for the benefit of Jewish residents in the area, like the St. George's settlement, that was now being enthusiastically used by the local non-Jewish population. So these institutions were surviving. The East End, concluded Levy, is still an essential part of the London Jew's life. But A.B. Levy's optimism was misplaced. By the 1950s, the Jewish population of the East End had halved, and in the following 2 decades, the remaining small synagogues, shops, and welfare organizations closed down or followed their congregants and clients to the suburbs, with the exception of Petticoat Lane Market, where Jews continued to trade and to shop for many decades. Jews experienced rapid social integration, declining religious observance, and advancing secularization in these decades. But in another way, the East End did continue to be central to London Jewish life as part of London Jewish memory. And in the rest of this talk, I'm going to look at writers of this period, this immediate post-war period, who were registering the demise of the Jewish East End by transforming it in their writing into a place full of symbolic meaning. The memory of the Jewish East End was shaped during the 1950s by some key influential texts, and perhaps the most influential, certainly the best known in its time, was the novella A Kid for Two Farthings, published by the writer Wolf Mankiewicz in 1953, and also made into a successful film in 1955. Mankiewicz was born in Fashion Street off Brick Lane in 1924, the son of a market trader. But his family left Spitalfields for East Ham when he was 4 years old, meaning that the East End was no more than a faint childhood memory for him. Unusually, among the working class Jewish writers of his generation, Mankiewicz went to grammar school and to Cambridge University, where he was involved with the Communist Party. That actually was something he had in common with a number of the working class Jewish writers of this period. But his education was distinctive. Higher education was distinctive. He was later to become a successful screenwriter in the 60s, but in his earliest fiction, he returned to the East End, powerfully conjuring the image of a place as yet untouched by wartime bombing, a place that was impoverished, but socially cohesive. A Kid for Two Farthings is set among Jews in Spitalfield during the 1930s. And it very clearly references quite precise locations. It's kind of very clearly located in a recognizable Spitalfields. So we have the Animal Market in Club Row. We have the disused shirt factory in Fashion Street, and the market, of course, Petticoat Lane Market. But despite these elements of realism, it's a place that somehow feels timeless. The narrator says of the tailors, the market traders, the pugilists, the tramps who populate the story, that they had always been there. And he describes, too, the parade of pedestrians in Whitechapel Road. Girlfriends with bright lips and dark eyes and loud laughter, mothers and fathers arguing together, calling to children licking toffee apples and taking no notice, old men talking quietly, raising their eyebrows, knowing the truth of things. And these sorts of descriptions of the parade of people in Whitechapel Road, these have been repeated throughout the 20th century. And it's as if here Mankiewicz is really trying to keep alive something that was a very distinctive aspect of the social life of Whitechapel. And here the tailors are out of work, times are hard, it's the 30s, it's the Depression, but the tailors shrug their shoulders and accept this is how things have always been. So there's a sense of a kind of timeless, unmoving place where things stay the same. And in that world, what provides inspiration and comfort is storytelling. At the center of the narrative is a young boy, Joe, whose father has gone away to seek his fortune in South Africa. And Joe is sad and lonely. And to console him, his kindly neighbor, Mr. Kandinsky, the tailor, tells him a story about the unicorns, their persecution, impoverishment, and their exile to Africa. When Joe finds a sickly baby goat in the market, he believes that it's a young unicorn, and he embellishes Kandinsky's story in his private games, and he imagines journeying to Africa, triumphantly leading the unicorns back to Fashion Street. And this strange, haunting, sweet story is a sort of oblique kind of allegory of the disruption of Joe's family, but also of the European Jewish diaspora. Joe is part of a community, many of whose parents fled persecution to live lives of poverty in London, and are carrying those memories with them. And in Joe's own little fantasies, his embellishments of Mr. Kandinsky's story, he gives himself the role of Redeemer or Messiah who can make it all better. But the animal is not a unicorn, it's just a sickly young goat, and the goat eventually falls ill and he has to be taken away. And Kandinsky explains to Joe that the animal's disappeared because unicorns can't grow in Fashion Street, but boys have to. So in the end, this story is turning away from the false comforts of fairy tales towards a reckoning with real life, with gritty realism. And that same sort of move is echoed in a subplot, which is about Kandinsky's employee, Shmuley, and his girlfriend. And the girlfriend desperately wants him to buy her a diamond engagement ring, but Kandinsky persuades her to forgo the ring so that Shmuley can instead invest in their small tailoring business. And this is going to provide a much more stable financial future for the young couple. So he's successful in persuading her that to dismiss consumerism in favor of a sensible spending of money. And in both of these plots, he is in this way a kind of benevolent agent of pragmatism, persuading the characters to liberate themselves from their fantasies and face the real world. And yet, at the same time, the whole story takes place in what is essentially a fantasy world, an East End that is run by responsible employers, by benevolent landlords, and by loving families. And all of these enable individuals and young boys, young couples to blossom and prosper. So this version, this fiction of the East End, this kind of memory of the East End, turned it into the setting for a folk tale. And this very much reflected Mankiewicz's own interest in the Yiddish folk literature that had flourished in Eastern Europe before the Holocaust and was just beginning to be translated into English. So moving on from this to something very different indeed. And I think the second most significant text remembering the Jewish East End was Arnold Weska's play, Chicken Soup with Barley, which was first performed at the Belgrade Theatre, Coventry, in 1958. And unlike Mankiewicz's fairy tale, this is an uncompromisingly realist account of East End Jewish life, offering absolutely no comforts. Weska was born in 1932 of immigrant parents, and his childhood was spent, like Mankiewicz, in Fashion Street in Spitalfields. His family moved to an LCC flat in the Upper Clapton Road in 1942, and this distance from the East End, that was the vantage point from which Weska looked back to the East End of his early years. Unlike Mankiewicz, Weska had no higher education, but as an aspiring writer, he made contact with and joined a circle of left-wing intellectuals who were in the 1950s beginning to challenge the limited representation of working class lives in British theatre and film. And Weska really wanted to take part in this movement, really felt that was his vocation. And he paid homage to the very first memoirist, the very first writer to write a memoir of the Jewish East End, who was Willie Goldman, who'd published his memoir in 1940, East End, My Cradle. And Goldman, Weska said, made him feel that, quote, my own experiences and milieu might provide material for writing. So it was really important to him that someone had done this before, that the Jewish East End was recognized as a milieu worth representing, as something worth writing about, material worthy of literary representation. And Weska was also galvanized by seeing the first production of John Osborne's play, Look Back in Anger, in 1957. He was galvanized by its dialogue, by its diagnosis of the moribund state of English culture, and by, he wrote, an exhilarated feeling that not only was theatre an activity where important things were happening, but one where I could add to what was happening. And while all this was going on outside in coffee bars and in the Royal Court Theatre, Weska was transcribing conversations among his family at home in their Hackney flat. And for years, ever since he was a teenager, he had been taking note of the way that his family spoke to each other. He obviously, from a very young age, had a very strong interest in dialogue, but also in the particular voices that seemed to him distinctive of the Jewish East End, to the Jewish families that he knew. So in his papers, which I've researched, you can see that over and over again he's writing about the ways that his mother speaks. He was trying to capture the particular quality of her voice, especially when she was arguing with him. So Weska's writing is, really comes absolutely out of his own life. He was noting down, transcribing every detail of what was happening to him in these years, and much of this made its way into his writing, into his plays, but also into his fiction. But at the same time, he always wanted to tell a broader story than simply just his own personal autobiography, the autobiography of an East End family. So Chicken Soup with Barley is set over 3 decades, the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. And in these 3 decades, we see snapshots of the Khan family, headed by the Jewish matriarch Sarah, a devout and devoted communist. Over the decades, her fractious but loving family finally breaks down, gradually and finally ultimately breaks down into bitter, unresolvable conflict and loss of political faith. And at the same time, the 3 acts of the play track the unfolding crisis for British communists in these 3 decades. The action begins when their flat is a hub of political activism in the East End of the 1930s. And in the subsequent years, we see the mantle of revolutionary politics, first embraced by Sarah's son, Ronnie. He used the name Ronald because it was actually an anagram for Arnold. So first of all, so in the second act, Ronnie becomes the inheritor of Sarah's radical politics. But in the third act, we see his shock and disillusion at the betrayals of Soviet communism, and in particular, Stalin's persecution and execution of the Soviet Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. So the play ends very devastatingly with nothing, with no answer, no future, no hope. Wesker's representation of the tormented battle between mother and son is really very powerfully moving. And I mean, so much so that although it's very much a story of its time, it was revived at the Royal Court about a decade ago, and to extremely rapturous audiences, which suggests that he was capturing something not just about that period, but something very profound about the family relationship as well. And I think perhaps what's most impressive about it is that it really is uncompromising. It doesn't provide some kind of final resolution of any kind to their conflict. So the play ends with Sarah's insistence that she will cling to her belief no matter what challenges come to assail it. All my life I've fought, she says, with your father and the rotten system that couldn't help him. All my life I worked with a party that meant glory and freedom and brotherhood. You want me to give it up now? You want me to move to Hendon and forget who I am? And Ronnie, her son, unable to counter her convictions, but also unable to share them, bitter with loss, is reduced in those last moments of the play to stammering silence. But the force of this ending, forceful though it is even in itself, the force of this ending really derives from its contrast with the energy of its opening scene. The East End, Wesker wrote in his memoir, was a ferment of activity. Lives collided in sweatshops, political groups, workers' cultural associations, youth clubs, street corners. That generation before me lived vociferously, argumentatively, emotionally, with a kind of desperation. And this is Wesker's East End, an East End frenzied with political activity and idealism. Heaven was never reached, he wrote, but a community of generous souls grew up around the idea of and hope for paradise. Those round my mother were concerned with each other's children as well as low wages and the state of the world. And Wesker debated with himself for a while about how he was going to represent the moment of greatest optimism and greatest innocence in which the activists and his young family of the East End felt that they had a purpose in the world and felt united with their comrades in their struggle. And when he was searching and thinking about how to set that, how to find that moment of kind of optimism about the world being made a better place through struggle. He reached back into a moment beyond his own memory, or almost beyond his own memory, to the Battle of Cable Street. Sorry. The days, he wrote, of the Spanish Civil War and the anti-fascist demonstrations in the East End, of course, when Jews and Gentiles, for an incandescent moment, respected one another, held hands, shared angers, threw barricades across the intersection of Whitechapel Road and Commercial Road, and rolled thousands of marbles into the paths of mounted policemen with batons, toppling their ferocious steeds. That thrilling day when Sir Oswald Mosley's black shirts were thrown off their provocative route through the Jewish streets of London, and many were lured to believe the end of capitalism was imminent, the millennium just across the road at Aldgate Pump. The year was 1936. I was 4, aware of nothing, but so electrifying had the riots been for my family, so full of anecdote, of little braveries and farce, of colourful personalities, that it was talked and talked about into my teens until I felt I had lived those days with them. So Wesker experienced an intimate familiarity with memories that weren't his, but felt nonetheless inherited. And yet the rest of the play is an attempt to interrogate the legacy of such memories, the impact of carrying them into times in which everything is different. What's most significant about Wesker, I think, is that he put a woman at the center of his account of the East End, and that the play takes absolutely seriously her loving, even if simplistic, idealism. As he wrote of his childhood, it's the women who surge strong and clear. I came from and was nurtured by a family of women, mother, grandmother, aunts, cousins, sister. And I think actually the most moving moment of his very long memoir comes at the very end of it, when he describes finding, he reads after her death the diary of his mother Leah, and he finds in her diary a really extraordinary entry for November 1958, which is a few months after Chicken Soup with Barley was first produced. And in this diary entry, Leah rewrites the ending of Chicken Soup with Barley. In her version, the son rushes in on his mother, who is she's wearily waiting for him to come home and have a cup of tea with her, and she's going to make a cup of tea for him and his wife. But he comes in only to tell her not to bother because he's going straight out again. In this tiny fragment, this is what she writes. Kisses her and goes out. She sits down again, a little forlorn and miserable, and says to herself, once more, I'll have to get used to him not to be at home. I do feel lonely. Curtain falls. So that is Leah's version of how the play should end. Very different from Arnold's version. Now, Wesker and Mankiewicz had no female contemporaries. There aren't any women writers who were writing about the Jewish East End in this period. And that's why I think this fragment is so especially valuable, because it offers us an idea of what an East End Jewish woman's perspective might have been. And it's certainly not that she felt powerful, forceful, or energetic as she appears in her son's, idealized imagination of her. In fact, in Leah's rewriting of her son's drama, it's the mother, not the son, who's left alone and reduced to silence at the end of the play. And the last book I want to talk about was published just a few years after Chicken Soup with Barley by a much more established novelist of working class London, Alexander Barron. Barron was born in 1917, the grandson of Jewish immigrants from Russia who'd arrived in London in the early 20th century as young men, followed by their families. He grew up in Dalston and Stoke Newington and was familiar with the East End from weekly visits to his grandparents, although in exactly the same way as the other writers I've talked about, it was a place that he visited more than actually lived in. In his memoir, Barron recalled the streets of Spitalfields, where his maternal grandparents lived, as thronged and noisy with children playing, hawkers and itinerant musicians, and their lively home filled with kinsfolk. Barron recalled the family ritual observances of his childhood with fondness, but he rejected religion and became an active communist in his teens when fascists were flooding the streets of East London. Now, London is the subject of much of Barron's writing. He was a very prolific novelist, a very brilliant novelist, but I'm just going to talk about one of his novels, which was published in 1963 and is called The Lowlife. The narrator, Harry Boy Boas, has roots in the working class Jewish East End. But as the novel opens, he's visiting his sister Debbie, who has married a middle-class bookmaker and moved to the North London suburb of Finchley. He's not a middle-class bookmaker. He's a bookmaker who's become wealthier. Also comes from a working class family. Now, Debbie and her husband live in a joyless landscape of conspicuous wealth, isolated in a large house with servants. While she and her husband remain rough-mannered and warm-hearted, their 3 daughters are seriously committed to upward mobility. All thin, all snooty, all the sort that flute mummy and daddy in high-class accents. They kiss mummy and daddy and feel a little more ashamed of them every year, says the narrator. While Debbie longs for Harry Boy to follow their path into material security, Harry Boy instead disdains the hypocrisies of bourgeois life. Rather than accumulating capital, he is a compulsive gambler whose life is structured by a repetitive cycle of earning, spending, winning, and losing. As he repeatedly turns his back on the path to prosperity in this way, Harry Boy is also decisively rejecting the myth of the aspirational immigrant. And instead, Harry Boy is drawn back to his East End birthplace. The place holds me, he says. There's only the place left. The East End of Barron's novel is the bomb-scarred landscape that A.B. Levy documented 15 years earlier. Of course, the bomb sites were still there 15 years later. So that experience of the Second World War was still very present to everyone in the 1960s. Harry Boy goes to the East End to lament at the site of the lost synagogue where he had his bar mitzvah, to stand at the locked gate of the empty dairy, to inhale what he thinks are the odors of many people close together, to encounter the few surviving Jewish residents with their familiar, candid grumpiness. He goes to weep at the spot in Cable Street where his childhood ended brutally when his mother died in a wartime air raid. This is a place of absolute loss. A gap in the decaying shops, this bomb crater, patches of diseased weeds, black puddles, rusty bedsteads, sodden newspapers, old prams, smashed packing cases, and the turds of tramps. But for Harry Boy, the East End, now derelict and abandoned, is the repository of immigrant memory. I cannot come to the East End without leaving present times behind me and entering the world of the past, he reflects. And the pain is this, that my too solid flesh in the world of the past is like a ghost of the past in the solid world of the present. It can look on, but it cannot touch. And the image of ruins that he sees all around him is constantly reminding Harry Boy of the losses also of the Holocaust and the guilt of his survival. He experiences London as a ghostly city that provokes disruptive memories, both of local pre-war Jewish immigrant life and also of the exterminated lives of Jews of other cities. Severed from his roots by the war, but also by his family's own determination to forget their roots, Harry Boy is disconnected from the present and incapable of moving forward. But the novel's other key location is a down-at-heel lodging house in Hackney, where Harry Boy lives. Barron's Hackney is a border zone between the East End and the suburbs, inhabited by a mix of Cockneys and hopeful transient newcomers. And it's these people, Harry Boy believes, who maintain the most authentic link with the East End ethos of working class respectability. So he imagines the immigrants from the Caribbean who are smartly dressed for church on Sundays as the natural inheritors of the Victorian residents of the street. And the Cypriots, he writes, they gather at their gates, throwing their children in the air and kissing them when they come down. Hackney is the place where modern London is being actively built, in the collective spaces of the streets, where children of different backgrounds mix freely in their games, or in the communal landings of the lodging houses, where food is shared. For Harry Boy, that cosmopolitan energy of immigrant families and the communal experience of crowded living represents an alternative story of London, of vitality galvanized by struggle. And as he opines to his Caribbean neighbor, the way we eat, that way we live. You and me, Joe, we mop the plate dry. We suck the last gob of marrow. We lick our fingers. From our fathers and our grandfathers, we know hunger and we value food. In our blood, we know an axe can fall on us at any second. So we live. We live. The Jewish East End is over, according to Barron, but its spirit lives on in Hackney. So, bringing this all together, I think what I want to say is that these three writers who all came from immigrant Jewish backgrounds were all remembering the same place and also, in fact, remembering the same time period. Yet for each of them, the East End, the Jewish East End, meant something different. For Wolf Mankiewicz, it meant the warm family and community ethos that could foster young people's self-confidence and optimism despite economic hardship. For Arnold Wesker, it was the clarity of political purpose and a belief that fighting together collectively would advance social justice. For Alexander Barron, it was the rejection of modern consumerist aspirations and the valuing of sensuality and living together. What these writers had in common was a set of questions where religious or political faith once made the world clear. And they had also in common a nostalgia for the close community of their parents' generation. And in this feeling, they weren't alone. It was a widespread response to the social transformations of the 1960s, when many in the working classes were experiencing unprecedented affluence and social mobility. And yet, at the same time, each of these writers felt themselves in many ways to be outsider figures. And their central characters, too, are outsider figures, holding up a mirror to the post-war Jewish community, looking to the past as a resource that helps them think about the present. Alistair Levy, Emily Peasgood, and Saima Tariq, the sound artists who produced the installation at Tower Hamlets Local History Library and Archive, also use the past as a resource to think about the present. The Battle of Cable Street looms large in each of their works, just as it did for the writers I've discussed tonight. And they also bring new, intriguing approaches to thinking about memories of the East End, not just the Jewish East End, of course. Emily's installation reminds us that it is a childhood rather than an adult world that is recalled in the oral history recordings, complete with all the poetic rhymes and surreal observations characteristic of children's speech. In Saima's work, among many other things, we have a strong sense of the East End streets themselves carrying memory, the memory of congregation and protest, and the structural inequalities affecting racialized minorities that persist in the same locations across time. And Alistair's work explores the emotional attachment a speaker feels to their East End birthplace and the complex layers of memory and forgetting that accrue to it. In all these ways, the artists update and extend the distinguished tradition of interpreting the history of the East End. And so I'd just like to end by thanking the AHRC and Tower Hamlets for making this research and this exhibition possible, and to encourage you in the strongest possible terms to visit it in the next few weeks, if you haven't already. It's open until late in November, so please do go. Thank you very much for your attention this evening.